Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. I'm Tim Gray, and today we're going to be talking about tips for better HDR images. If I was feeling a little cheeky, I might have called this How to Not Ruin Your HDR Images, or How to Not Further Destroy the Reputation of HDR Photography. We're going to focus on just trying to make sure that we're producing the best images possible when it comes to HDR. We'll talk more about those details in just a moment, but first I want to thank Tamron just really quickly for sponsoring today's presentation. If you happen to be a Tamron user, if you're using Tamron lenses, don't forget that you can use the hashtag #WithMyTamron when you share your photos through your favorite social media site, and you might be featured in a special gallery. All right, so moving right along, let's talk first and foremost about what HDR is. I suspect many of you, if you were interested in HDR photography in the first place, if you signed up to join me for this presentation, you probably already know what HDR is. But I just want to emphasize that HDR, which of course I think we all know stands for High Dynamic Range, HDR photography is essentially just tone compression. So, for example, here, this photo that you're looking at happens to be a photo captured in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state. Some of you might have guessed that already. And of course, it is of one of the more well-known red barns in the Palouse. I should hasten to add, if you don't see a red barn, don't worry. We'll get to that in just a moment, so you don't need to post a question saying, "Where's the red barn?" But this is indeed a photo of one of the most popular red barns out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state, but we wouldn't ever know it because you might say the exposure is too dark. Except the exposure is perfect. Well, maybe. Close. Possibly. Nearly perfect. For the moon. But of course the moon, this is a full moon, and as we hopefully all know, if we want to photograph a full moon, the full moon sets or rises around sunrise or sunset, depending on the timing. And that's because in order to have a full moon, the moon needs to be on the opposite side of the Earth as the sun, and so essentially the rising or setting of the moon will coincide with the rising or the setting of the sun. In other words, a full moon, in terms of rising or setting, is going to be happening at a relatively dark time of day. And the moon itself is reflecting lots and lots of sunlight. You can think of the moon as being daylight, essentially. So now what happens to the barn? Well, it's lost in the dark because I've exposed for the moon. Well, the barn is still there, and I could, in fact, take a picture exposed for the barn. So now we get to see that red barn out in Palouse country. But now if you notice, the moon itself has lost all of the detail. We have just a white disk with no detail at all. And put simply, that's because an exposure for the moon is too dark for the barn, and an exposure for the barn is too bright for the moon. We can't have everything, and so we need to either compromise and just choose what's most important in our scene, or we can compress the overall tonality of the scene into what I would call a normal range, at least for purposes of digital photography, of digital imaging. And so with HDR, we're capturing multiple images. We'll talk about the process there shortly, but we're capturing multiple exposures so that we can capture a full tonal range, and then we're compressing all of that information into a single photo. And so we might come up with something along these lines, for example, just a quick and dirty composite or an HDR. We've taken an exposure for the moon, we've taken an exposure for the barn, and we've blended them together. And that really, in a nutshell, is what HDR is all about. But I've got a little tidbit of information for you that might seem a little bit crazy. HDR is a temporary workaround. One of these days, HDR photography will be obsolete. I don't just mean that it is going out of style. It's, of course, very popular, owing to how many of you wanted to join for this presentation today and how many HDR photographs we see out there. But what I mean is that eventually it won't be necessary at all. So remember, we're compressing the tonal range of a scene when we're using HDR techniques. Why do we need to do that? Well, because our cameras, for example, can't capture that full range of tonality. and our monitor displays can't project that full range of tonality. And of course, our printers can't print that full range either, but eventually, at least in theory, we might get to the point where our cameras can capture a wider dynamic range, and we've already seen this occurring over time. We've already seen cameras increase their overall dynamic range, the overall tonal range that they're able to capture. Part of that relates to bit depth and how things are mapped in the camera. Part of it relates to the individual pixel size, if you will, on the image sensor. There are a variety of factors, but the point is that cameras, digital cameras, have gotten better and better when it comes to tonal range, to dynamic range. And so eventually, at least for more basic scenes, we won't need to capture multiple images in order to preserve all of that tonal range within the image. But in the meantime, of course, we need this workaround. We need to capture multiple photos to capture the full range of tonality in certain situations. Obviously, on a foggy day, you're probably never going to need HDR techniques, but at sunrise, at sunset, when there's very strong contrast or reflections, that's when HDR is going to become most important. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about HDR, it seems that very often when you mention HDR photography, there's a shudder. People react very strongly and often not in a very positive way. And so when it comes to trying to avoid those sort of negative reactions, essentially HDR has gotten a bad reputation. And I don't even have to explain why. I can just show you. I can show you exactly why HDR photography has such a bad reputation. And if you want to avoid that bad reputation in your own photographs, well then don't do this. Here's a classic example of HDR gone wrong. It's oversaturated, there's not enough contrast, there's frankly too much shadow detail. My personal approach when it comes to HDR imaging is not to try to preserve every bit of detail you can possibly find in a scene, but rather to overcome the limitations of my camera. If my camera could capture the full range of tonality in every scene, I would never use HDR techniques. I would simply take a picture and then perhaps optimize that picture in post-processing. I wouldn't need to capture multiple exposures. It's only the limitation of my camera that causes me to use HDR imaging in the first place. And so I don't want to create a final result that looks like a bad HDR. I want to create a result, generally speaking, that more or less looks like a normal photographic image. And also, I think it's very important, besides not making some of these mistakes, and I'll show you some processing a little bit later today to give you a sense of the most common mistakes, things that you might want to be careful about or avoid altogether. But overall, I think what's really important is to not treat HDR photography as being completely different from normal photography. In other words, remember the basics. Remember composition. I see many HDR photos where the photographer seems to have looked at the scene, recognized that there was tremendous tonal range there, and then captured multiple photos in order to create an HDR without really thinking about the photo itself, without thinking about composition, without thinking about all of the things that make a great photo in the first place. So, first and foremost, we want to remember the basics of photography. We want to remember the overall concepts as it relates to composition, to choice of lens, to our overall exposure settings. I'll give you an example of that shortly. But in other words, let's keep in mind that we're still creating a photographic image. I still want to remember all of the basics of photography. I'm just adding an extra little piece to overcome the limitations of my camera. And then I would add that it doesn't need to be obvious. Well, of course, we saw that don't do this image, the hot dog stand from Vienna, Austria that I showed you a couple moments ago. That was terribly obvious. Everyone knows instantly that that's HDR. More specifically, everyone instantly recognizes it as bad HDR. But with a scene like this, for example, and this happens to be a scene from Rome, many of you, of course, will recognize the basilica in the background there at the center of the frame. And this is a wonderful view through a keyhole, as it turns out, in Rome. And I would hope, I think, my goal here, you can let me know if I succeeded or not, my goal is that when someone looks at this photo, they don't immediately think HDR. In fact, let's assume that non-photographers might be familiar with the general concept of HDR. They might recognize that hot dog stand as HDR, but they hopefully would not recognize this as HDR. And in fact, my greater goal would be that many, maybe even most photographers would not recognize this as HDR either. That it might take you a moment to say, hey, wait a second. How did he do that? Because we've got some bright light in the background, diffuse light, but still bright, relatively speaking, and then this kind of dark tunnel through the hedges. How did he retain so much detail? Oh, it must have been an HDR, but I don't want it to be terribly obvious. If you take a look at the individual captures that were assembled to create that final image, you'll see that I have a range of exposures from dark to bright, and you can see that it really was a rather significant tonal range, all things considered. The rightmost exposure, the basilica, has essentially just disappeared altogether. We have a fair bit of shadow detail. In the second photo from the right, the basilica is almost disappeared. It's mostly there, but not completely there, and we have pretty good detail in the hedges. And as we move over toward the left, we get more detail in the basilica, but much less detail in the foreground. I should hasten to add, by the way, that really odd kind of halo effect that we see on the far right of the far right image, that sort of odd bright vignette. That's because I'm literally photographing through a big keyhole. So that's actually the edge of that metal, the frame, I suppose you could call it, of that keyhole, that plate. But again, the point is that our HDR results don't need to be super obvious. We don't need to recognize in the HDR that it was an HDR. Another tip, this one hopefully goes without saying, and that is to pack your tripod and to actually use it. Now, I don't know about you, we can all handhold up to a certain exposure duration, right? Maybe, up to 10 seconds? No, of course not. So here, I believe my longest exposure for this scene was 20 or 30 seconds. And so that is beyond my personal limitation when it comes to hand holding, and so a tripod will become necessary. Now, contrary to popular belief, a tripod is not necessarily always necessary. I have handheld many HDR images with great results, but a tripod can be helpful. And the one thing that I would add is that very often, when I'm using HDR techniques, the reason that I'm using those techniques is that, of course, there's a high dynamic range, but in many cases, I find that those situations, at least for me, most often occur with night photography. I want to open up a little bit of shadow detail. I don't want to lose all of the detail. For example, the dome there in the background, the largest dome, you can appreciate that if I exposed for the overall shadow areas, then I would lose most of the detail in that dome because there's some very bright lights shining onto it. And so, by definition, if I'm doing a lot of my HDR photography at night, it also means there's less overall light, and so I'm more likely going to need relatively long exposures, which means I can't hand hold. In some cases, I might be able to just raise the ISO a little bit and then capture with a handheld automatic exposure bracketing, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, I do find that when it comes to using a tripod, there is a little bit of a risk of complacency. And what I mean by that is that you might think that you don't need to worry about motion because your camera is on a tripod. Or you might be photographing a scene and you feel like there's no movement here. So I'm looking up at the ceiling of this portico with a little bit of a view out into the square, and so I would naturally assume there's no people in this photo, there's no airplanes going by. Maybe the clouds in the sky might move a little bit, but I'm going to be relatively quick capturing my images, and so I don't need to worry about movement. Everything, for all intents and purposes, with the exception of the clouds, I would say in this case, everything in this scene is static, and my camera is static, and I'm maybe even using a cable release or a timed exposure, a timer for the actual shutter release, so maybe I don't need to worry about movement at all. And yet, even with automatic exposure bracketing in this case, movement that I did not anticipate was actually there. And so if I switch to another image in the sequence, and then back again, If you look carefully at that lamp that is hanging from the ceiling of the portico, you'll see that from frame to frame, it moves a little bit. So it seemed so very solid, this big, heavy lamp hanging from the ceiling, except for the part that it is hanging from the ceiling, and it was swaying just a little bit. Just a little, so little that I didn't even perceive it, or maybe I didn't think about it, so I wasn't paying careful enough attention, but that movement can create a problem in my final processing. The software that enables us to assemble our HDR images does enable us to also remove ghosting, and this is a perfect example of that ghosting. So we have movement within the overall sequence of images, so there's going to be ghosting. The lamp, in this case, will essentially appear in two places, overlapping, but in two places. And so the software can process that duplication and remove the ghosting, usually. The results are usually pretty good, but I'd rather try to avoid that altogether if possible. So in a case like this, perhaps if I waited for there to be no breeze, for that lamp to settle down, then I could capture a sequence of images a little bit more quickly while there's a little bit of a pause in that movement. And speaking of which, paying attention to that overall scene, being aware of your surroundings, watch for the framing. If you notice, well, let me go back to the darker version of the image. This is sort of how I was seeing the scene, not just with my camera, but with my eyes as well, because, as you can appreciate here, the background was very, very bright. And my eyes were adjusted for that background. I had been walking around outside. It was a bright sunny day with some scattered clouds. Sure, I walked underneath the portico to that shade, but my eyes were really adjusted for that exterior area, and so this was more or less the scene that I was seeing. If I waited for my eyes to adjust a little bit, then I might have seen this version of that scene, essentially. And you can see at that top right corner, I have a little bit of a dark, I don't even know what that is, a dark area of that portico, and it's distracting. Ultimately, I would want to crop that out. The key is to pay attention. I mentioned, don't forget about the basics. Always remember that we are still capturing a photographic image. We want to make sure that we're being careful about our overall framing. And I do find that that tends to be neglected a little bit when it comes to HDR. I also think something that gets missed a lot, but I think that can add, as long as you're going HDR, let's go extreme HDR and consider including the sun in the frame, because that really represents the biggest range, you might say, of potential tonality in a scene, is having perhaps some shadow areas and having the sun in the frame. Now, what I do suggest, though, is to not try to make sure that you're keeping detail in the sun for all three channels. That would call for an extremely dark exposure, and frankly, you don't need that level of detail, at least with a kind of normal scene that includes the sun within the frame. But by including that sun in the frame, you can add an extra dynamic element. And again, this, I think, it provides a good example of a situation where it doesn't need to look like an HDR, like a bad HDR in any event. And so here, when processing the image, for example, I have this abandoned farmhouse out in the Palouse, the backlit wheat, the sun just coming up over the hills, and I kept the shadows relatively dark. In fact, I clipped a little bit of that shadow detail in order to make what looks more like, in my mind at least, a more realistic photographic image. I didn't try to have tremendous detail in the shadows and full detail, including sunspots in the sun. I just tried to have a reasonably good amount of detail in the sun and what looks to my eye to be relatively normal contrast for the overall scene. So I'm using HDR techniques to enhance the degree of information, of texture that is visible, but I'm not going overboard with it. And I should hasten to point out, by the way, part of the reason that I chose the lens I did here is to get lots and lots of rays in that sunburst effect. This happens to have been with the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter lens that I'm only slightly embarrassed to say the real reason that I took that lens out to the Palouse with me is because I wanted to create some sunbursts with lots and lots of rays. It's a 9-bladed aperture in that particular lens, and so with an odd number of blades, we get double that number of rays, so there's 18 rays in that sunburst, which Yes, I know it's a little bit cliche, but I happen to like that particular cliche in many of my photographs in any event. I also think that it is very important to try to be consistent. Now, I know many of us hopefully are shooting just about everything in RAW, and I would say that is critically important when it comes to HDR photography. So perhaps the RAW aspect goes without saying. By virtue of shooting in RAW, it does not matter what white balance setting you use in the camera. You can use any setting at all because that really just represents, for a RAW capture, a metadata setting for the image. You're not permanently altering the capture data, you're just putting a couple of numbers into metadata, and those numbers will be used as the default settings for your color temperature adjustment in post-processing. But there are two reasons that I recommend using a white balance preset in your initial capture. Number one, that will help you avoid tricky scenarios such as this. This is what the image would have looked like if I hadn't adjusted the overall color for the scene. This is what the camera thought made sense for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. That seems way, way, way too yellow to my eye. But in any event, this is what I would have ended up with, and instead I was able to achieve more accurate color. This has a little bit of additional adjustment applied to it, but the idea is that we can get a more accurate starting point. Again, that's not critical for a RAW capture, but I do find that it is helpful nevertheless. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, it gives us a more consistent starting point for all of those images. So I don't need to, for example, concern myself with synchronizing a set of adjustments for all of my individual captures first. So not a critical setting, not a critical step to be sure, but something that I do recommend as being very helpful. And then when it comes to defining the actual captures, we need to capture multiple images, and so of course we want different exposures, and that really translates into adjusting generally the shutter speed, but we only need 2 stops of separation. There's no need to use 1 stop of separation between your exposures. And so I could use either bracketing, we'll talk about that, or I could adjust manually. And generally speaking, the approach then would be to capture a range of images that encompasses the full range of tonality for the scene, separating by 2 stops. And what I want to do, in most cases, there are some exceptions, but generally, I want to fix the ISO setting at an appropriate value based on my other overall photographic goals, and then I want to fix my aperture, again, based on whatever my goals might be, stopping down the lens so that I can get a starburst effect, for example, or opening up the lens aperture to get less depth of field if I want very narrow depth of field for whatever reason. But again, setting my ISO and my aperture based on my overall goals for the photograph, for the scene that I'm capturing, and then adjusting the shutter speed from one frame to the next. And so here, for example, capturing a dark exposure, and then if I'm in my manual, if I'm capturing all these frames manually, I might be in my manual exposure mode, for example, and perhaps not using automatic exposure bracketing, and then I would capture that first image, and then adjust the shutter speed by 2 stops, a 2-stop brighter exposure, or a 2 stops longer exposure in this case by adjusting that shutter speed, and then capture that image and adjust by 2 more stops, and so on until I have the full range covered. And covering that full range is very important. The whole point of an HDR interpretation of a scene is to encompass all of the detail, to overcome the limitations of your camera when it comes to dynamic range. And so I want to cover the full range. Later in post-processing, I might change my mind, essentially, in a manner of speaking. In other words, I might decide to block up a little bit of shadow detail or give up a little bit of highlight detail, depending on the specific circumstances, but I want to make sure that I'm capturing a set of images, a sequence of images that cover the full range. And in some respects, this is actually easier with a manual approach as opposed to automatic exposure bracketing. We'll talk about the bracketing in just a moment. But the basic process that I would use here is to start off by figuring out an exposure that will enable me to retain highlight detail. There might be some exceptions, specular highlights, the sun in the frame, for example, or bright reflections on shiny objects. I might let some of that detail go, but as a general rule, my first exposure will be an exposure that enables me to retain all of that highlight detail, at least to the extent possible or to the extent that it makes sense. So I've captured that first image, and then I want to capture additional images, again, separating by 2 stops. And so, for example, if your camera is set to adjust the shutter speed in half-stop increments, then 2 clicks of that wheel will equal 1 stop, so you can rotate by 4 clicks of the wheel in order to adjust by 2 stops for a longer exposure duration or a brighter exposure. And then I'll see for my next exposure, in this case, we're probably getting just a little bit of highlight clipping there, maybe at least on one channel, and a little bit of shadow clipping, and then I'll brighten again by 2 stops. Now we definitely have some significant clipping of the highlights, and I think a tiny, tiny bit, at least on the green channel, a little bit of clipping for the shadows. And so I go a step further, and my approach, in actual fact, tends to be to continue brightening up my exposure for that sequence all the way until I reach the point where not only is there no clipping, very clearly no clipping of the shadow detail, but I'll actually pull that black point in a little bit, not quite all the way to the midpoint, the middle of the histogram essentially, but relatively close, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it gives me more flexibility in terms of how I'm interpreting the final result, and 2, it helps to reduce the appearance of noise in my final image. Perhaps in most cases, not a huge factor. You can see here, for example, these exposures were all made at an ISO setting of 100, so noise is probably not a huge concern in this case. But this approach, it's essentially similar to the expose to the right philosophy. It will help to reduce the overall appearance of noise in the image. So before we continue on to the next tip here, we do have a couple of questions that I wanted to address. So Bob asked what the aperture was for the light rays, and so there have been a few photos that I've shown. I mentioned that I'm a fan of that cliche of the starburst effect, and so the general rule there is to stop down the lens. The specific result will vary based on your particular lens, the lens you're using. The number of aperture blades determines how many rays there will be in that starburst, and then the aperture setting determines the extent to which it appears. As a general rule, I stop down to f16 or f22. With some lenses, you'll get a good result depending on the circumstances, starting at around about f11. But generally speaking, if I'm aiming for a starburst effect, I'll just go all the way to f16 or f22, perhaps adjusting based on the overall exposure situation. And then as it relates to the color issue, I mentioned that color temperature preset, and Lon asks if I recommend using the same temperature preset for all images. Yes, absolutely. And so you could dial in a custom value, you could use a custom white balance setting in the camera. Generally speaking, I don't even mind if it's less than perfectly accurate. I just like to make sure that the images are captured consistently. And so based on the lighting conditions, so if it's daylight, then I would just use the daylight setting, the preset in your camera, cloudy versus incandescent, for example. So just choose the preset in your camera that represents the best fit for the actual conditions under which you're photographing. All right, so when we're capturing that full range, then we have the option of also speeding things up a little bit, and that is where automatic exposure bracketing comes into play. And this is really my preferred approach to capturing images, especially because today's cameras give us a wider range of exposures when it comes to that bracketing. Back in the good old days of digital photography, our bracketing gave us 3 exposures. So in many cases that might have been enough. We could have, for example, a normal or metered exposure, as well as a -2 stops exposure, as well as a +2 stops exposure, and then combine those 3 exposures together. And with 2 stops of separation, that is more than likely going to give you a full range for the tonality, for the dynamic range of a scene for most typical situations. But of course there are exceptions. And so now we have cameras that will give us 5, 7, sometimes 9 individual captures as part of that automatic exposure bracketing. And so that is very much my personal preference. In many cases that might give me more images than I need, but I'd rather frankly have too many images than not enough, and personally, I prefer the more efficient workflow, the faster process of just enabling automatic exposure bracketing and firing away. Now, you'll need to check your camera's settings, of course. You'll need to maybe even reference the manual, I'm sorry to say. But if you check your manual for the camera, you can learn all about adjusting the settings. As a general rule, it means determining the overall exposure compensation. With this example, the settings that we're looking at on the back of the camera here, we have an overall setting. My even exposure, as it were, or my central exposure, is set to -1 stop. And in many cases, I might need to err on the side of underexposed images. I might need more of them to cover my full range if I have some areas of very bright light, for example, the sun in the frame, as compared to other situations where I might be more worried about shadow detail and I might want to err on the side of more bright exposures. So I can adjust that overall balance and then adjust the separation. So here I have my exposures separated by 2-stop increments. So I have a -7, a -5, a -3, a -1, a +1, a +3, and a +5. Again, probably more than I need for most situations, but frankly I find it just a lot easier to set it and forget it, to adjust my settings overall, 2 stops of separation, maybe fine-tune the overall balance for exposure compensation. And with most cameras, you'll want to then use a timer to capture the sequence. So use a 2-second timer, for example. In most cases, if you do not use a timer, then you would, in this case, for example, with 7 exposures, need to press the shutter release 7 times, essentially, to capture 7 images with the exposure automatically adjusted for each. I would rather let the camera do all that work for me, and I want to make sure that I'm capturing the sequence of images in as short a time frame as possible. And so I would set a 2-second timer, enable the exposure bracketing and adjust my settings as needed, and then get myself all framed up, perhaps on a tripod, perhaps not, depending on the circumstances, the overall lighting conditions, for example, keeping in mind that the exposure, some of those exposures may represent very long exposure time. So you might look through your viewfinder and see that the camera is saying 125th of a second is your recommended exposure, your recommended shutter speed, and you think to yourself, well, that is easy to handhold. Yes, but don't forget, we're also going to have images that are much brighter, that are exposed longer, and so you might end up with multiple seconds for your final exposure, again, depending on your specific configuration. And so by configuring your camera with automatic exposure bracketing, generally speaking with a timer for your shutter release, then you're going to greatly streamline your workflow for capturing those HDR images. So this is the approach that I really prefer and that I highly recommend. But again, some photographers prefer to take a manual approach, and I certainly understand that. Now, when you're capturing these images, and especially if you're shooting handheld, then I also strongly recommend that you capture more than one sequence. So here's a few sequences of the same basic scene, and you can see in this case just 3 exposures. It wasn't a tremendous range of tonality overall. 3 exposures work just fine, but I've got multiple images, and there are a variety of reasons that I want multiple images. Essentially, it boils down to something might go wrong in the scene and something might go wrong with me. So, for example, maybe I use that 2-second timer with automatic exposure bracketing, and just as the sequence starts, a bird flies through the frame. So now I have a bird reappearing in every frame in a different position for each, and now I've got to clean that up. Or maybe I wasn't holding so steady when I'm using that handheld approach. Keeping in mind, I might be relatively stable, but I'm not as stable as a tripod. And so even when I'm using automatic exposure bracketing and capturing those images in relatively fast succession, there's still going to be a tiny bit of movement of the camera. The software I use to process my images can certainly compensate for that and align the images, but I want to minimize that. And there's also a degree of risk. So with this particular scene that we're looking at, for example, you can see that I'm under a little bit of an overpass, a portico here, and I have that tower in the background. And if I move just a little bit, I might cause the tower in the background to get cut off a little bit by that arch. or to at least get a little closer than I want it to be. And so having more than one sequence of images just gives me a little bit of insurance, helps me to make up for any issues that might have occurred either with me, with my camera, with the scene. And of course, not a bad idea to check your work before you call it good, before you decide that you're finished with that scene. And then I think it's also important to remember that there is an additional time factor that relates to HDR imaging. First and foremost, I mentioned that bird flying into the scene. I might have a timer set for my automatic exposure bracketing. Maybe I'm using a 2-second timer, for example. So that automatically adds a 2-second delay. I can't anticipate everything that might possibly happen, that bird flying into the frame or whatever the case might be. In addition, even though I'm using, in most cases, automatic exposure bracketing, there is a degree of potential difference from one frame to the next. So maybe the bird flies into the frame right after the second exposure out of a total of 7 exposures, so I couldn't anticipate it, and even with automatic exposure bracketing, there's still enough of a time lapse there that potentially something might change within the scene, and potentially to the point of being problematic. And then also in many cases, our exposures for an HDR will be of a longer duration, a longer time. The time value, the overall shutter speed, may be a little longer in order to, for example, get as much detail in the shadows with a night scene as we possibly can. So, for example, up in the top right area of this image, up in the sky, you might see just a little streak of light because I presume that was an airplane. Of course, I've had situations where I thought it was an airplane or a shooting star and it ended up being a satellite, but there is some bright light up in the sky, a little bit of a streak, and so because of one of the longer exposures, I have something, a bright light, appearing in the frame, and I'm going to need to pay attention, and in this case, remove that blemish, essentially, if I so choose, in post-processing. But the idea is to try to be aware of the fact that we're capturing images possibly with a delay, certainly with multiple exposures, and therefore even with bracketing, there's a little bit of a time factor involved in capturing all of the images in the sequence, and there's a good chance that at least some of our exposures will be of a relatively long shutter speed or a relatively long exposure duration, and so we want to take all of that into account and be especially careful of that overall scene, of how we're photographing it, of our timing, and again, capturing multiple sequences, checking our work, making sure that we have great images. With this type of scene, for example, I would try to time my exposures when there's no breeze. If a sudden gust of wind blew up, I know those trees in the foreground down at the bottom center are going to move a little bit, potentially creating ghosting, and so I'd want to pause and just wait. So I would say that HDR photography in many respects is just normal photography, but it is normal photography with that added twist, and so we want to be sure that we're focusing first and foremost on creating a great composition, a great overall scene, a great exposure, and then we're doing a good job making the most of those individual sequence of images, those individual captures that comprise our final HDR result. Now, of course, the photography is just one piece of the puzzle here. There are essentially 2 overall steps that are involved when it comes to creating an HDR image. We could break that down into multiple steps for each, but in general, we're capturing the images and then we're assembling the final result. And that involves, of course, taking our multiple exposures, blending them together, and then also applying some adjustments. We'll talk about that, but in order to actually perform that work, we need to choose which software we're going to use. And I would say this decision is something that is changing on a regular basis. I'll show you my top 3 picks at the moment, and I'll send you more detail in a follow-up email. I can get you a copy of an issue of Pixology magazine that had a little bit of a roundup of HDR Software Solutions. But my current favorites would be Nik HDR FX Pro 2, Adobe Lightroom, and then a relatively new product, MacFun's Aurora HDR Pro. So let's talk about each of these briefly, and then I'll show you some workflows. We'll probably not cover HDR effects as part of today's presentation, but I'll show you a couple of other workflows that you can use. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. First, Nik HDR FX Pro, and this is version 2. That was from Nik Software, which was acquired by Google not too long ago. And Google said They're not going to update the software, but they'll keep updating at least to make sure that it will run on new operating systems, etc. Except that has apparently changed as well. So while Nik HDR Effects Pro was my favorite tool for processing HDR images, many users are now finding that it is no longer compatible with their operating system or as a plugin for Photoshop, for example. They're running into some compatibility issues there, and Google has updated their statement to indicate that it works with slightly older operating system versions and slightly older versions of Photoshop, for example, but they are not going to update it. So it is free now. You can find the Nik collection for free on the Google website. It's entirely free, but you may run into some compatibility problems, so I would say it's time to start looking for an alternative. For the moment, I'm actually using Adobe Lightroom for many of my HDR captures. By extension, anytime I talk about Lightroom in the context of processing images, there's a very good chance that you'll be able to do everything that you can do in Lightroom using Adobe Camera Raw in most cases, or some variation on that. I'm going to show you that workflow with Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw for HDR processing in just a moment. And then an up-and-coming tool, you might say, and I think Aurora HDR Pro is going to be my favorite tool, my preferred tool very, very soon. It keeps getting better and better, and with each new release, I'm finding that I enjoy working with this software more and more. As you might interpret from the company name, MacFun, it is a Macintosh-only software tool for now. Windows users, rest assured that MacFun Software has made it clear that they are working on a version of Aurora HDR Pro for Windows. I don't know exactly when that will be available, but they're already talking about it. You can bet they're already working on it. And so we can look forward to a Windows version of Aurora HDR Pro, hopefully in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for that. Let's go ahead, though, and take a look at some of those options. I'll just show you a typical workflow to give you a little bit of a sense of that overall processing. And before we do, of course, we need to remember that we're going to exercise restraint. And so let's see what that restraint actually looks like. So I'm going to start off. I'm working in Lightroom at the moment, and we'll just find, maybe this set of images. You already saw the final result that I had created for this sequence of images, a set of 3 captures. And what do we have here? The middle exposure was 10 seconds, the longest exposure was 30 seconds, and then the shortest exposure was 1.5 seconds. But I have those multiple images, and I can process them right inside of Lightroom. And part of the reason that I'm actually favoring this approach right now is that the workflow is very streamlined, and then I can just continue using the develop module for my tone mapping. So when we're processing our HDR captures, there are 2 basic steps involved in that. Yes, there's the 2 steps, the 2 processes of capturing the images, then assembling the final result. But within the context of assembling that final result, we also have the need to assemble the basic HDR and then also to tone map. And in other words, we're taking all of these exposures, the dark, the middle, and the light. That represents a huge range of overall tonal values, more than my camera could capture with a single exposure. And now I'm creating a high dynamic range. Generally speaking, that means a 32-bit per channel image, as opposed to typically a 16-bit per channel image. So we have a huge number of possible tonal and color values, but now we need to compress that. Remember that compression of the overall tonality that I referenced at the beginning of today's presentation? We need to compress, and that is referred to as tone mapping. So first I'm going to create the actual HDR. So I'll go ahead and click on the first image here and then hold the Shift key and click on the last image. I could go into the Develop module if I want to apply some adjustments. And so, for example, if I'm in the Develop module with multiple images selected, I'll click on the thumbnail for the middle exposure here just so that I can see the actual image a little bit better. And then I'll come over to the Sync button and flip that switch. That little light switch there will enable automatic synchronization so that as I'm applying adjustments to the image that we're currently looking at here, all of the other selected images will also be adjusted. So, for example, just for illustrative purposes, I'll convert this image to black and white. I'll just choose that black and white treatment option. I could obviously continue working with other adjustments here, but you can see that all 3 of those exposures have now been converted to black and white. I'll then go up to the menu, and I'm going to choose the photo menu, followed by photo merge, because I want to merge multiple exposures into a single image. And after choosing photo merge, I want to select HDR. And this is just the creation of that HDR, that high dynamic range image. While that preview is building, you'll see that I can auto-align. Remember, if, for example, I was using automatic exposure bracketing and shooting handheld, there's going to be at least a tiny bit of movement from one frame to the next, and the HDR processing software, in this case Lightroom, can automatically align those. The auto tone option is really just a convenience setting. We'll be able to fine-tune those settings after we process this HDR image. We'll see that in a moment. And then I can choose a deghosting amount. Remember, if there's movement in the frame, if that tree were moving in the breeze a little bit, then the leaves appear in different positions in each frame, and I can use this deghosting to mitigate that, to compensate for that. And so I could choose low, medium, or high. When in doubt, I usually, at least initially, process the images without deghosting, because if I use deghosting when it's not necessary, sometimes the software might create some errors. In other words, I'm creating a problem when I was trying to fix one. If I enable one of those options, then we would see, because I have that Show Deghost Overlay checkbox turned on, we would see a red overlay indicating any areas of the image that have some apparent motion. In this particular scene, there wasn't any, so I'll just leave that set to none. So you can see, very easy. Assembling that basic HDR image is a piece of cake. Essentially just establish my settings here and click Merge, and then Lightroom will process all of those images. So in this case, 3 individual exposures, and we'll assemble them into a high dynamic range image. In theory, a 32-bit per channel image. In the case of Lightroom, it actually happens to be a 16-bit per channel floating point, but let's not get bogged down in math. All right, so now we have that final result, which happens to be a DNG image. Now, what if you decide that you would have preferred this in color? You might be thinking, Tim, why would you convert this to black and white? It should be in full color. And now you've gone and processed the image with a conversion to black and white that you synchronized across all 3 of those images, so now you're stuck with black and white. Except Lightroom is smarter than that. I've created an Adobe Digital Negative here, but all of the adjustment settings that I applied based on the original captures, those have actually just been applied essentially as metadata. So Lightroom is non-destructive even in the context of creating this HDR image. And so, for example, if I switch back to color, then I have the full color version of the image that I can work with. Now, I mentioned that we assemble the HDR and then we perform our tone mapping. The tone mapping in the context of Lightroom is actually done right here in the Develop module. And so part of the reason I like this workflow is that it's just everything that I'm already accustomed to. So perhaps I do indeed want to convert to black and white, for example. Maybe I want to add a little bit of clarity, except remember, I talked about being careful not to overdo it, to exercise some restraint. I don't want to go too far with clarity because there is a degree of risk of creating halos or other problematic artifacts. And in fact, one of the most common problems as it relates to HDR imaging is artifacts. And usually that is owing to applying too strong an adjustment, to trying to extract too much detail out of the image. Exercising a bit of restraint will help to minimize that risk. You may be able to see a little bit of halos up above the dome here, for example, and a little less so along the horizon off in the background. So remember, I was talking about how I want to create an HDR image that doesn't exactly look like an HDR image to the untrained eye. So essentially, I just want to treat this image as a normal image. And so in this case, I'll go ahead and reset my white point and the black point just to give me kind of a neutral starting point here. I might back off on the overall exposure. I'll reveal the histogram just so you can see what's going on here. If I back off too far on exposure, I'm going to start losing too much of that shadow detail. And so instead, I might pull back the whites a little bit and then even bring back the highlights and just try to find a good balance. And this can be the most difficult aspect of HDR imaging, quite frankly, is finding settings that make sense, you sort of start to get a little bit desensitized to seeing so much detail in an image, and so you might have a tendency to go overboard. It does take a little practice to kind of exercise that restraint, that self-control. But for example, in the case of Lightroom, using the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh to get the clipping preview when I'm adjusting the black point or the white point, taking the black point down until I see some clipping, and in most cases bringing that value back up until I have just a little tiny bit of clipping. Doing the same thing for the whites. I have some very bright specular highlights out here over to the right center. Those I might not worry about too much. And then the highlights, those are taken down a little bit too far. If I find that I'm hitting a limit, so for example, you can see here, I might want to open up, in this case, a little bit more shadow detail, but I've reached my limit for shadows. That's what tells me that I need to bring that exposure up just a little bit. So I'll raise that exposure and then bring that white point back down, again holding the Alt or Option key on the keyboard to see that clipping preview. I'll bring those highlights down a little bit so I'm retaining a little more detail in those bright highlights, and that gives me more detail in the shadows. I can double check my black point here, maybe right about there. And I think actually in this case I might like to just darken up those shadows a tiny little bit to get a little more density, because I want it to be obvious that this is a night scene and I want there to be some decent contrast. So that is a process for working with those images in Lightroom. I assemble the HDR and then I go through all of my normal adjustments. Now here I've just focused on some of the basics. I would still, of course, want to apply, for example, lens corrections and maybe some noise reduction, whatever is needed to make the most of the image. Don't forget that at this point, for all intents and purposes, we're working with a normal image in Lightroom. It just happens to encompass a larger range of tonal values than I was able to capture with a single image. Then we can take a look at processing in Photoshop. And in Photoshop, we have HDR Pro. My preference, my recommendation, is to initiate that process within Adobe Bridge. And so very similar to Lightroom. And again, what I'm going to show you is a workflow that essentially mimics what we just saw in Lightroom. So if you're a Photoshop user, not a Lightroom user, this is an approach that you can use. I'll start in Adobe Bridge and once again click on the thumbnail for the first image in my sequence, hold the Shift key and click on the last image in that sequence, and then I'll go to the Tools menu and choose Photoshop, and I want to merge to HDR Pro. So Tools, Photoshop, merge to HDR Pro. Those images will then be sent to Photoshop for processing, and then each image will be processed and assembled and merged, but I'll have some decisions to make along the way. Once again, there are those two basic steps. We're combining all of that exposure information into an HDR, a 32-bit per channel image, and then we're performing tone mapping. And in the case of Photoshop with HDR Pro, we can actually perform both of those steps essentially all at the same time, you might say. So we can process the images with HDR Pro to create our HDR image, and then we can also perform the tone mapping within HDR Pro. But there's a problem with that. I don't think HDR Pro does a very good job of tone mapping. I find that it creates problems more often than it creates good results. And so I don't like using that approach. If, for whatever reason, you wanted to use HDR Pro for your tone mapping, then you would want to set the mode to 16 bits, and generally speaking, I would use local adaptation for the pop-up to the right of that bit depth, and now you can see we have a small set of adjustments. So similar to the process we saw in Lightroom, where I'm able to access all of those various adjustments, except here, it's a much smaller number of adjustments. So I don't have as much flexibility. So my personal preference is to instead only use HDR Pro to actually create that HDR image, to create the actual 32-bit per channel HDR image. I'll go ahead and process that result, keeping in mind I have not yet performed the tone mapping. This is sort of like that first step in Lightroom without then working in the Develop module. I have an HDR image, but I have not mapped it to what essentially I would think of as a 16-bit per channel actual image. If you take a look at the tab for the image, you'll see that reference to 32. This is a 32-bit per channel image. And so, for example, you'll see that a variety of my adjustment layers are not available. I can't use the black and white adjustment, color balance, vibrance, for example, because this is a 32-bit per channel image. So I want to convert to 16 bits per channel, and I want to use Adobe Camera Raw for the tone mapping for much the same reason that I prefer using Lightroom for that full workflow if you're a Lightroom user. And I could have turned on an option within that HDR Pro dialog, but also there's an additional step. So if we go into the Preferences menu and choose File Handling, you'll see that I can use Adobe Camera Raw, this checkbox right here, use Adobe Camera Raw to convert documents from 32-bit to 16 or 8-bit. In other words, if I have a 32-bit per channel HDR image and I'm converting it to either 16-bit or 8-bit, I would always recommend 16-bit, I can then see the Adobe Camera Raw dialog and apply those adjustments exactly as we just saw within Lightroom. So I have that option enabled. I'll go ahead and close my Preferences dialog. And now, when I convert, now keeping in mind, I have a 32-bit per channel image here. I could fine-tune the exposure if need be or apply other adjustments. We'll bypass that for the moment and simply go to the Image menu and choose Mode, followed by 16 bits per channel. And because I had that option enabled in Preferences, when I perform that step, I will see the Adobe Camera Raw dialog. And so now I have what are essentially, not even essentially, I have what are the adjustments, the same set of adjustments that are available to me in Lightroom when processing my images there. And so if you are not a Lightroom user and you want the same basic adjustments available to you, you can use this workflow of assembling the image with HDR Pro in Photoshop and then tone mapping using Adobe Camera Raw. And your final result, of course, at that point will be a 16-bit per channel image with the adjustments applied. And I just want to show you very quickly the workflow that is available in Aurora HDR. So I made reference to this software. It's getting updated on a regular basis. There is a Windows version coming at some point in the hopefully very near future. Stay tuned for that. But I've launched Aurora here. I'll just choose the Load Images option, and then I can go find a few images that I want to process. Maybe I'll just use those same images of the abandoned farmhouse. So I select the multiple images that I want to combine together. I can then choose that Open option, and you'll see that the workflow here is quite streamlined. Down at the bottom, I have settings for alignment, ghost reduction, and chromatic aberration reduction. Very similar to what we saw in Lightroom with the addition of chromatic aberration reduction. So turning on all of those options, which I generally would want, I'll go ahead and click the Create HDR button. And of course, since I've chosen ghost reduction, I can choose which image I want to use as my reference. In other words, if there was movement from frame to frame, which image should be used kind of as the basis of that object. If there was something, a bird that flew across, we'll take the bird from that middle exposure, for example. And then I can adjust a strength setting here. I'll just use low in this case, and then I'll click that Create HDR button. And now all of those images get loaded into the full Aurora HDR interface. And we don't have enough time, and today's focus was not really on everything you need to know about this particular software tool for processing your photos. But once the images are processed, I'm able to use a set of presets, which we'll see down at the bottom here in just a moment. I can use those presets as the basis of any adjustments, essentially. In other words, to give me a shortcut to a specific look for the image. There's a very cool feature there that I'll show you in just a moment, but all of those presets are really just shortcuts for all of the various adjustments that are available. You can see some of them over here on the right-hand side. And so those presets are just quick ways to get to some default settings, you might say, for a particular look. You can then fine-tune to your liking. So very similar overall to what's possible in Lightroom. Once this is processed, I've got a few images here, and I've got a lot going on this computer, so it's taking its time. But with all of those options enabled, the processing is being completed, and then we'll be able to see. I do want to show you one very cool feature that relates to those presets. and then we'll address some questions. I know we're just about out of time here, but I'll try to address as many of those questions as possible. In fact, maybe we'll run a little bit long today just to make sure that we can get to as many questions as we possibly can. So Terry asks a really good question. Where does Photoshop stand in your rating now? And I might not have made that abundantly clear. Oh, sorry, that was Photomatics. So let me actually address both of those, though. Photoshop, I put essentially more or less on par with Lightroom. There's differences in the overall workflow, but very similar in terms of the results, especially because the Develop module in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop, you might say, are the exact same thing. And so those are equals. When it comes to Photomatics, this used to be my go-to tool for processing HDR images. And what I've found over the years is that I was increasingly not very happy with the results I was able to achieve with Photomatics, and I was happier with results I was able to achieve with other software. And so I would say it's probably fourth on my list. Everyone who is registered for this presentation, this webinar today, I'm going to send you in a follow-up email a link to the issue of Pixology magazine that includes the roundup on those software tools so that you can get a better result. Before I jump to the next question, let me just show you that cool feature for these presets here in Aurora HDR Pro. So I have all of these presets down at the bottom. Very quick and easy thumbnails with a variety of different looks that I can achieve. And so I can go through and maybe I think that this particular interpretation works well. Again, keeping in mind that the presets here just relate to settings, specific saved settings for all of the many adjustments that are available. But one of the things that I think is so cool about Aurora HDR as it relates to these presets, notice this little slider. I can tone down the strength of that effect. So I can say, I like this, it's just a little too strong, I want to tone things down a little bit, let me dial down the strength. So I think that's just a brilliant feature in Aurora HDR when it comes to using those presets and really being able to get the most out of them. All right, so we have some questions here. So then, a good question as far as Aurora HDR, is it creating a DNG the way we see in Lightroom, for example? And no, we actually would then save our final result. And so I would, if I'm exporting to an image, I would generally save this as a TIFF image. You can see that TIFF option down below. So we're not creating a DNG. That essentially is just an approach that Lightroom uses. Even in Photoshop with HDR Pro, we are not creating a DNG image. So Keith asks, which settings will produce a better final result? 3 images at 2 stops of separation or 5 images at 1.5 stops of separation? As long as you're covering the full range, there is no reason to go below 2 stops of separation. So if you only needed 3 captures and you have available 5 captures with your exposure bracketing, there's no need to go to 5 exposures and reduce the separation. 2 stops is all you need. There is no benefit to reducing that value. What about continuous shooting mode instead of 2-second exposure? Yes, theoretically, if you're holding down the button with continuous shooting without that timer, your camera will then capture those images in sequence. My particular concern there, maybe it's a little bit I'm worrying too much perhaps, but my issue there is that I feel that when you're capturing by holding the button down, the shutter release with continuous firing, continuous shooting, I feel there's too much risk of you moving the camera more. If you have a 2-second timer, to me that gives you a moment. Press the button, start the timer, get yourself stabilized, kind of release your breath, hold your breath as it were. Press if you're shooting handheld, press your arms, your elbows against your chest, etc. Get yourself nice and stable, and to me that's just going to give you better overall results. All right, and Aurora HDR, of course, can be used as a plugin. Yes, indeed. Aurora HDR, I showed it as a standalone software tool. It is also available as a plugin. So if you're using Lightroom, if you're using Photoshop and therefore Adobe Bridge, Aurora does operate as a plugin. Thank you, Kevin, for pointing that out. And then will auto ISO default to automatic exposure bracketing and defeat, I should say, automatic exposure bracketing? I suppose it's possible with some cameras, but what I would say in general is that no, that is not a concern, because the auto ISO is going to establish, in most cases, a fixed ISO for that sequence. Really good question, actually. Do I use Photoshop in layers in Photoshop to manually blend exposures versus using an HDR image? In some cases, yes, indeed. I find that that produces a superior result. So if you recall this image, for example, I was having a heck of a time because of, in large part, that penumbra of the moon. I was having a very difficult time getting a result that worked well. I tried every HDR software tool out there and still was getting a very rough edge to the moon, and so I actually ended up using a layer mask. And I would say in many situations, if you find that you are only creating an HDR sequence because you have essentially two areas, bright and dark, so for example here the moon versus the rest of the scene, you may find that it's much easier and much more effective to simply combine using a layer mask in Photoshop. Really good question, Michael, about sharpening, and I would say in general my preference is to save sharpening for after you've assembled your HDR image. If you sharpen the original captures, there is, especially with those longer exposures, or if you had to raise the ISO setting, there's going to be variable noise in the different images, and that can be exacerbated by sharpening and other issues as well in terms of artifacts. And so I would very much prefer to not make use of sharpening until after I've assembled the HDR image. And then Bob asks, if I decide to change the white balance in post-processing, would you change it for each image prior to creating your HDR or change after the fact? Frankly, with most software tools, the way they process those HDR images, it's not critical one way or the other. That said, my personal preference is to get the overall color as close to perfect as possible from the beginning, and so I would tend to synchronize that overall color adjustment. So if we come back to our images, let me get back to my folder here, and if we take a look at the HDR that I assembled, which was my black and white, right? Oh, I flew right past it. So if we come back to this night scene, which I flew right past again, this night scene in Rome. So here's my DNG image that I created within Lightroom. If I wanted to interpret this in color, I could switch back to color. I still have that ability to fine-tune after the fact, but generally speaking, I would rather have gotten that corrected beforehand. So what I would say is, if you can see right from the start that the color is problematic, then I would correct for that in the initial captures before you create your HDR images. But generally speaking, you'll still get great results. Keeping in mind, of course, that we're typically talking about a 32-bit per channel image, so we have a lot more headroom for applying those adjustments in that little post-processing, that tone mapping stage of our workflow. I'll take a couple more questions here. Marcia asks if I can go into a little more detail about the white balance preset, and that would just be, by preset, I'm referring to those options in your camera, essentially anything but auto. So when you're shooting RAW, you certainly can use auto white balance in your camera. Instead, when it comes to capturing a sequence of images, so here we're talking about HDR, the same would hold true if we were talking about images in a composite panorama. Again, if I'm shooting RAW, it's not critical because I can adjust after the fact, but I would prefer to have all of the images equalized, you might say, set to the same value so that I have consistent color for all of those captures. And so that would mean, for example, setting for this scene probably incandescent, for example, or I might use theoretically fluorescent even here. A daylight scene I would set to daylight, cloudy, you know, whatever the case might be based on the specific settings. Oh, and Joe asks, I mentioned a specific HDR photo. Oh, so the photo contest. Yes, actually, I'm happy to re-mention that. Not a photo contest exactly per se, but as long as we're addressing that question, if you tag your photos with the hashtag #WithMyTamron for any photos that you've captured with a Tamron lens, then your image might be featured in that gallery. So you can take a look There's the website address there. I'll put that in the follow-up email as well for anybody who wants to take a look at that. And then George asks, once the images are merged as the result, so a JPEG, a TIFF, a DNG image, whatever the case might be, does it remain in RAW? So your original RAW captures, of course, remain untouched. You're creating an additional image, you might say. So you have your source images captured in RAW, and then you're creating something else as a result. In the context of Lightroom, that something else will be a brand new file in the Adobe Digital Negative file format, a DNG file. In most other cases, you'll be creating a TIFF image. In Photoshop, you could choose what you want to save it as, but generally speaking, that master file would be a TIFF or perhaps a Photoshop PSD file. So George asked a question about the starburst effect and how it impacts the rest of the image. And I also want to expand on that to talk about lens flare. The starburst effect can have an impact overall in terms of variability from one frame to the next. And so sometimes you might see some subtle little artifacts depending on the software you're using. So do pay attention to that. If you're including starbursts, whether it's a sun or another bright light source in the frame, if you're seeing any artifacts, or I should say, if there's a starburst, do pay attention to make sure that you're not seeing artifacts in the image. I have found that some software tools are better at producing a good result than others. The software that I've talked about today does a very good job at that, Lightroom, Photoshop, and Aurora HDR. But there is a degree of variability, but related to that is lens flare. When you've got the sun in the frame, lens flare is essentially unavoidable. In this case, with these particular images, in fact, we can go take a look at those images really quickly so that I can show you that result. And if we take a look, even right here, it's visible. They're a little bit more visible. I actually, in this case, chose my position in part because of the lens flare that you can see here. I wanted to position that lens flare in the open sky. I originally had been over toward the right a little bit further so that the lens flare was lining up with the abandoned farmhouse here. I shifted my position in order to get that lens flare into the sky. Now, I actually liked the overall balance of that position better. I liked kind of the bookending of the scene. If I liked the other framing, I don't know if I would have necessarily compromised, but that lens flare can be a problem as well. So any type of artifact like that can be problematic. The overall starburst, so here, for example, going to the bright exposure, you'll see that I don't have any starburst in the sky, whereas over here I do. The software will usually do a pretty good job with that, depending on the software. The tools I mentioned today do a good job with that, generally speaking, but the lens flare is still unavoidable when you've got the sun in the frame. So I try as much as possible to make sure that that sun flare will be in a position such as the open sky here, where it's going to be relatively easy to resolve. All right, maybe just one or two more questions here. If I did completely miss your question, I certainly apologize. Please feel free to send me a follow-up email, and I'll try to address as many of those as possible. Really good question from Terry. Is it worth creating a variable density image? Creating multiple images from one file in Lightroom. And what I would say, it's one of these kind of trick workarounds to create an HDR when you don't have an HDR. And what I would say is that with Lightroom, you generally have enough latitude with your adjustments that there's not a real significant benefit. The idea is that you could take the same raw capture and process a normal version, a light version, and a dark version, and then assemble those resulting images. So for example, create TIFF images out of each of those, and then assemble those using a raw processing tool. And what you'll find is that in most cases, that's going to give you no benefit compared to careful adjustment of that single exposure, because you're not actually getting more information than the original raw capture had. You're just processing in a different way. And then a great question from Ken, what about noise reduction? I sort of alluded to that at least briefly. I do save the noise reduction for after I've processed the images, because there will be a variable effect and variable noise reduction needs for each of the captures. And so I don't mind a small amount of noise reduction, but if there's a serious noise problem, I'm generally going to save that for post-processing. So create my HDR image, and then as part of the tone mapping or later, depending on which software you're using, that is when I would apply that noise reduction. And then Ken asks if I can give tips for those of us who don't have automatic exposure bracketing on your camera. That is where I would tend all the more to use a tripod, and because otherwise you're just going to move the camera too much from one exposure to the next. If there's movement in the scene, or if you're concerned about movement in the scene, or just in general you might want to capture those images as quickly as possible, then what I would do is figure out how many clicks of the wheel. So again, if you're using half stop increments for your exposure adjustment, then you would be turning that wheel for the shutter speed 4 clicks. If you were set to third stops, obviously that would be 6 clicks. And so I would just kind of practice a little bit of, for example, turning the wheel 4 clicks, pressing the shutter release, turning 4 more clicks, press the shutter release. And it's a delicate balancing act because you want to perform that work as quickly as you possibly can, but not to the point that you're actually kind of jerking the camera around a little bit and moving too much from one frame to the next. And so I would say that, generally speaking, just work as quickly as you can without being sort of panic-stricken. But again, without exposure bracketing, automatic exposure bracketing in any event, you'd have to perform that manually. So adjust your shutter speed between each shot and just trying to minimize the overall time. You might also, though, consider if your camera does not have automatic exposure bracketing, there's still a very good chance, almost a sure thing, that you can get a cable release that will give you that bracketing capability, and that may be a very worthwhile investment as well. All right, so we've gone a little bit over time today. We did have a large crowd on today's live presentation, today's webinar, so I wanted to give a little bit of extra time for those questions. Feel free to follow up with an email. I will be sending you a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a link to download that issue of Pixology magazine that I mentioned that has a roundup of various HDR software tools that you might be interested in learning more about. In the meantime, thank you again for joining me today for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Special thanks to Tamron for sponsoring today's presentation, and I'll hope to see all of you on a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Thanks very much.